I've looked after horses since I was a child, and they've been part of my life ever since then. And they still are every morning and every evening. Christmas Day, Boxing Day, whatever you like, they've got to be looked after. On my YouTube channel, Modern History TV, you can see some of my exercises in trying to work out how horses were used and looked after in the Middle Ages. Today's guest, Emma Herbert-Davies, has just written a book called The War Horse in England, 1272 to 1327. And I was excited to talk to her about her research and to find out even more about how people lived with horses hundreds of years ago, and to see whether stuff I do bears any resemblance to how they would have handled things in history. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Future Imperfect. I have a very exciting podcast to discuss horses in particular. Now, some of you will know I own and train and breed my own war horses, so I now have a genuine historian expert to come and tell me all about the things I didn't know, or maybe they don't know some things, and maybe we can share some information. So Emma, would you do us the favour of introducing yourself, please?
Yes, hello everybody. My name's Emma Herbert-Davies. I hold a PhD from the University of Leeds, and my thesis was on war horses, and specifically the war horses under Edward I and Edward II. So we're looking at the late 13th century to the first quarter of the 14th century. I have a book that's coming out on it, The War Horse in England, and that will be published by Trivent in February 2025.
Wonderful. Why did you choose that? I think I've got an idea, but why did you choose that particular time period? I know it's always good to narrow things down when you're studying stuff, but what's the thinking behind that?
Well, when I started to look at medieval war horses as a whole, I soon realised something really extraordinary was starting to happen under Edward I. And what we see is an entirely new set of accounts being raised by the Exchequer, and that's to record the financial dealings of the king's horses. It's called the Equitium Regis records. They survive in the hundreds from 1282. And these were a lot to do with the royal studs. And this was extraordinary because we don't have any of these kind of documents before Edward I. And although they continue up to the reign of James I, so we're looking at sort of the beginning of the 1600s, they survive in their greatest quantities for Edward I and Edward II. They start to take a dip, actually, during Edward III. But at that point, under Edward III, military tactics were changing. There were greater reliance on infantry and archers, and war horses were taking a less prominent role on the battlefield. So this 50-year period that I look at is what I call the heyday of medieval war horses and medieval war horse production in England.
Oh, that's really interesting. So do you think the fact that the records are there marks a sort of a change in official policy? What, maybe people were just finding horses for themselves and doing things sort of semi-randomly. But do you think the court suddenly decided, actually, we need to be a bit more thorough about this? We need to actually have a plan in place.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is all down to Edward I trying to get hold of war horses and failing. Now, when the First Welsh War broke out, there was a scarcity of war horses in England. So Edward and his nobility turned to France, to the great Champagne fairs, which attracted all the international traders from Italy and Spain and the rest of Europe, all selling war horses. And they shipped almost 250 war horses into England just for the First Welsh War. A few years later, we get a Second Welsh War, and they try again to import these horses. But the French king puts a ban on them because he wants them for himself. So Edward I is faced with a real political and practical problem here. He cannot get hold of enough war horses, and they're critical to be able to have an effective army and to field a really well-horsed cavalry. So his only option was to try and create a sustainable supply of war horses, and so he went into war horse breeding on an industrial scale.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, 250 war horses sounds on one hand like a lot of stallions. That's a lot of management. Anybody that knows about stallions knows they sometimes take a bit more handling, and they sometimes don't play well together either. You know, so it's not like you can often have a whole bunch. You can sometimes, but you often have to be a bit cautious about temperament and them fighting each other. 250 doesn't sound like very much. Yet again, sometimes 250 sounds like quite a lot. So do you think there weren't that many war horses in England in the army? Because it doesn't seem to me like that would make much difference.
Well, for instance, in the 1298 campaign, we estimate there were about 3,500 war horses went on that particular campaign.
Okay.
So certainly their numbers increased. There weren't that many in England to start off with. 250, this is the nobility, the cream of the nobility who can afford to import horses that are doing this.
Right.
And that's probably why the numbers seem comparatively small.
Yeah. So the way we might think of it, these are like special forces, they're the sort of tip of the spear type of horses. These are presumably well trained, they're well used to battle, they're used to wearing armour. I have got horses used to wearing armour, and it's a slow process. Or some of them actually take to it very quickly. Some of them don't. Some of them really are not happy for months. Now, I don't know what their training methodologies were. Is there any record of how they trained them and where they trained them? Were the centres of warhorse training?
Well, we don't have any warhorse training or any horse training manuals for that matter in the Middle Ages. And that's because horse training was a technique that was handed down orally. So it was something you learned as an apprentice. All we do have are hippiatric treatises, which are veterinary treatises that are sometimes prefaced by short sections on how to train a horse. They're quite concise. But what we also have from the records that I discovered under Edward I and II are lists of equipment bought to train young horses. And we can also trace the trajectory of horses as well as they move around the royal studs. And it aligned very well, actually, with what I'd read in these veterinary treatises, that horses were selected around the age of 2.5. And from the age of about 3 to 3.5, they were then moved into the royal stables. They were referred to as foals until they were 5. So at 5, the horse was considered mature. So from the ages of about 2.5 to 5, that is when your war horse begins to get trained.
And that's really interesting because contrary to modern sort of techniques, a lot of people put a saddle on a horse at 3 and start riding it before it's 4. I've always felt that the horse isn't physically mature enough or mentally mature enough to do much beyond the very basics. So I would put a saddle on the back of a 3-year-old, but not ride. You just get it used to having a saddle on its back so that it's not a big thing for it. Used to having a simplest of bridles and the simplest of bits. But you don't put any stress on it for a long time because it's not physically strong enough. And it's interesting that it appears that the Iberian type of horse matures more slowly than the type of horse that many people listening to this might think of, the more sort of warm-blooded, kind of racehorse kind of derived. They seem to be pushed to mature much earlier, partly because of the finances of it. Obviously, it costs a lot of money to look after a horse for a year, especially a high-quality horse. And obviously, people want to get their return. I mean, they race horses as what they call yearlings that I think are 2 years old. And for me, I think that is probably slightly controversial here with all the racehorse people listening, but I think that's far too early. When I'm training my horses, I hardly do anything with them apart from handling until they're in their 5th year. And it's only roughly when they're 5 that I would consider starting to ride them more, not aggressively, but riding them more kind of regularly. So that's interesting that it ties in with what they're thinking. I also find that stallions in particular can go through a really awkward phase when they're sort of 2, 3.5 to 4. They almost go through their teen misbehavior phase. One of my stallions is homebred here called Thunderbringer, and he's been very, very difficult to handle. And he's just coming up to 5 now, and he's just started to behave well. Just sort of suddenly gone, oh yeah, okay, I get what you're doing now. I won't try and bite you or kick you. And you think, oh, this is remarkable. There's like a sudden change. So it's fascinating to think that that was the case back then as well. So what kind of equipment are we talking about in these lists?
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't know when exactly they first put the saddles on or started riding these horses.
Okay.
What I'm getting is these 2.5-year-old colts being brought in and stabled and head collars bought for them. And that seems to continue for about 8 weeks. So I think they're just getting handled and used to having their feet picked up and being led around at that stage. And then we start to get different types of equipment coming in. We get bridles, we get bits, we get honey to smear the bits so that the horse can associate them with the pleasurable experience. We also get something called longius and trainels. The longius are long ropes, always bought in pairs. And we also get surcingles as well, which are like the surcingles we use today. Now, this really got me thinking, Jason. What do you do with pairs of long ropes and surcingles on a young horses that you're breaking?
You do long rein groundwork. You walk behind them. So a surcingle is like a girth that goes all the way around, but has an arch over the spine to not put pressure on the spine, and sometimes has rings on the side which would replicate to a certain extent where the reins might go.
Yeah.
So if you have a long rein, the rein can go from the bit through the surcingle, out the back of the horse, and you can stand well out of kicking range, or very close. If you're being sensible to begin with, you stand out of kicking range, and you can give the horse all the commands that you would do when you were riding it, but not put any pressure whatsoever on its back. So yeah. That's what they were doing, no question.
And this isn't mentioned in the hippiatric treatises that you might long rein or lunge a horse, but we don't know where this system that we use today originates. I'm not saying it originated in the Middle Ages. I actually think that long reining and lunging went back a lot further than this. But what we're getting here is evidence that this equipment was used as part of a horse's training regime.
Yeah, and it's evidence of fairly high requirements, because you typically use long reining to train the horse to carry itself, to take simple commands, often verbal commands, because obviously you can't give any leg commands because you can't touch the side of the horse. You're not doing any weight on it, but you can control the feel of the reins on the mouth. And for those that don't train horses, reins are not for pulling. Reins are for communicating. They're there to allow you to touch the horse's mouth with your hands. And you should, on a good horse, it's not always the case. Some horses take up a lot more control than you would ideally like, but on a really well-trained horse, they're very light. You have a very light touch. You can hold the reins with almost no tension at all, just the weight of the reins themselves. And you can communicate by opening and closing your hands. And you can teach a horse to do that on the ground, so that when you transition to putting a saddle on the horse and then riding the horse, all you do is you just use the same commands through your hands. You don't have to use your legs at all. So now I wonder, is there any sign of any notes of long whip or anything to touch the horse's rump or anything like that?
No, unfortunately not. We don't get that, no. So we can only sort of conjecture and compare to how we would use this equipment to see how it could possibly have worked.
Yeah. And again, just for those people that, because obviously not everybody is fortunate enough to train horses and know how. So sometimes when you're doing what's called groundwork, where you're not riding a horse, but you're training it on the ground, you use a long whip. But calling it a whip is probably wrong. It's basically a long stick that allows me to stand by the horse's shoulder and hold the reins, but also I can tap parts of the body of the horse, not hitting it, but just tapping and say, activate your backside, or move your leg underneath you, very gently using those commands. And the best way of training a horse is to get the horse to understand what you want, and then it does it.
Yeah.
Very rarely do you get much quality training with any kind of cruelty at all.
No, and just because we don't see these kind of whips or sticks in the accounts doesn't necessarily mean they didn't use them. Generally, anything under a penny wasn't recorded. It was considered negligible anyway. So it's possible. It's possible they made them themselves using a piece of ash or something.
Yeah, a piece of ash or hazel, because I've done this before. I've had my long whip broken or trodden on by a horse or something like that. And it's like, I'm just going to get a piece of hazel. I've got some hazel coppice. It's very overgrown, but some hazel. I just thought, you know what? That's great. And you just cut a long piece of hazel. And of course, in the medieval period, hazel wattled, but it was a fairly standard, regularly available. So they might have just gone and got a whole bunch of very thin hazel twigs and used those and threw them away because they get trodden on by horses and broken, and you put them on the fire and burn them in that case. So yeah, why would you? You wouldn't record that because they weren't buying whips. They didn't need to. Any unusual types of equipment at all listed that we don't know what they are, or is it all recognisable from your perspective?
It's all pretty recognisable. They got through a lot of currycombs.
Right.
That was strictly list, which meant they were either falling apart or they kept losing them all the time. But you get them bought by the dozen. So they were obviously keeping these horses pretty clean as well, which I thought was rather lovely.
Yeah, that is lovely. And the other thing is you put combs down and then they get covered in hay or dung when you're cleaning out, and you can easily throw a curry comb away
Yeah.
with the horse dung by mistake. So maybe they were doing that then, It's like, where's that ruddy curry comb? We've got through 12 of them this month. We can't lose another one. The king's going to do his nuts. Wonderful. Okay, a little bit about the types of horses. So this is, I think, an area of really interesting kind of, not controversy, but interesting research. Some people think of war horses as massive, great, heavyweight monsters. What's your experience of, your knowledge of this area? How would you describe it to people?
Well, I think that this myth of the warhorse being a giant shire horse lumbering along with a knight on his back was sort of quite a Victorian myth, where they thought, oh, it's carrying a knight in armour, it's got to be an enormous horse. And I know the Warhorse Project has been recently reinvestigating some archaeological remains and have found that the majority of bones that they're pulling out of ditches are showing that most of the horses in England at the time were only ponies and 13 hands. But we have to keep this in perspective, because most of the horses in England would have been working horses used for either carrying packs or hauling carts as well. There is evidence that there were horses up to 16 hands. It's just that was quite rare. When we think of war horses, we need to move away from seeing them as just one type, a sort of one box fits all, because there seemed to be more than one type of war horse, and it depended how much money you had as to which type you rode in battle. So in the army lists of horses that we get, we have destriers, which are few and far between. Say less than 3% of the horses on a campaign in the cavalry would have been a destrier, and that's because they were so valuable. So you only get your great magnates like Spencer and Lancaster riding them. Most knights rode horses simply called equi, which is Latin for horses. They were worth roughly about £20. And then beneath them, you get your sergeants, your esquires, your wannabe knights, and they're riding roundseys, which are worth about £8. So your destrier could go up to about £80.
How does that translate? It's always hard to translate money into modern terms, but what could £20 buy you that we would recognise in the, how long would it take somebody to earn £20 in this period?
Let's have a look at one of the most expensive horses I found, which was Hugh Spencer's £80 destrier. And if you put that in a Bank of England inflation calculator, it comes to somewhere around about £80,000. You're talking, in comparison to an average labourer of the time, a lifetime's wages.
Wow.
So that's quite extraordinary.
That is extraordinary. That's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds, the equivalent, isn't it? Spending power or amount of effort an ordinary person has to put in to earn that.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why they were so few and far between those, because I think they were so valuable. As to what they looked like, because we don't have conclusive evidence of bones, we haven't found great pits of cavalry horses on battlefield sites. And I think that's largely because horses are eminently recyclable, aren't they?
Yeah.
Their skin, their flesh, their bones. We can only sort of conjecture what they look like. We've got manuscript images. They tend to show the horses being quite small, but medieval artists' sense of perspective wasn't all that great. Plus the fact they may have wanted to make the men look far more important by making them bigger. The exception is Geoffrey Luttrell, who seems to be on quite a large horse, the knight. There's a lovely image of him.
Yeah, that's in their Luttrell Psalter for those that are interested. And I think there's a picture of his wife handing his helmet up to him, isn't there as well? So we get two human beings there.
Yeah.
So he looks like he's on a very big horse, unless he's small and the horse is fairly big.
Yes,
it's hard, isn't it, to judge?
I know. It's so hard to judge, and also they're very stylistic portraits as well. But I think that looking at the images, we could certainly say that they weren't heavy horses. They seem to be light horses, and we get this in the hippiatric manuals where they describe the ideal horse. They don't like a lot of feather, which is the hair on the legs we commonly associate with draft horses. They seem to be quite fine horses. The hippiatric advice is to buy a horse with very strong quarters. It's got to be a powerful horse with a short back. They're really much easier to collect, and they have that thrust and that velocity as well that you probably need in a war horse.
Yeah, I've often felt that we could learn quite a bit from the type of horses used in bullfighting in modern days.
Mm.
You know, whatever one thinks of the morality of bullfighting, there are some extraordinary equestrians in that sector. And they are required to do similar things, I would imagine, to a warhorse. I also think if you look at modern dressage, you see a lot of collection, which, again, for those that don't understand horse stuff, it means the horse is sort of springy and ready to move forward at a moment's notice. If a horse is very relaxed, it can have a long head and a long neck, and it's all sort of flumping around, and it can't move so quickly. So if you think of a tennis player on the tips of their toes, collection is similar in some ways to that, you know, to the horse being ready to move to the left or the right and sort of having its strength centered around the rider. And I think from my experience, Iberian horses are particularly good at that. Sports horses who might be good at running and jumping are less good
Hmm.
naturally at that. They seem to have a bit of a longer back. And I think that's probably because the modern military cavalry horses had to do a different kind of job. They weren't really going into melee. I mean, they did do a bit of melee in the Napoleonic era, but they were more about traveling fast from A to B to get to the guns and spike the guns. And, you know, and so modern riding horses are largely derived from the kind of modern cavalry horse style
Mm.
in a way. And I wonder, you know, steeplechasing and racing and hunting, all of that kind of stuff requires a different kind of horse. I mean, for your interest, I've got one of my horses called Ghost, who's a Cremello stallion. He's Portuguese, he's a Lusitano. He is 15-1/15-2, depending on how he's standing. So he's not a tall horse. And when I first got him, I thought he was quite short. But as soon as you ride a horse like that, that's very powerful, you suddenly realize that the height doesn't matter. And I tell you what's really useful about a horse being really strong but not too tall is it takes less effort to get on them when you're in armor. You can get on a taller horse, but it takes a lot more effort. That extra 4 inches to get up over the back of a medieval saddle with your leg
Mm.
in armor can take it out of you quite a bit if you're doing it a lot of times in a day.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a personal experience of a shorter type of but very powerful warhorse.
Yeah. And I think if we were to time travel back to watch one of Edward the First or Second's armies moving into Scotland and we looked at the cavalry, I think they would be a real mix of horses. So I think height wise, you're probably looking from perhaps the Roundseys were more pony sized, they were the cheaper horses. Perhaps going up to the taller ones, maybe 15, 16 hands as well for your destriers, because if you're a leader, then you want to have high status both metaphorically and physically.
Mm.
So I think there's going to be a mixture of sizes and colours as well, because I did some work on the colours. I was really surprised to find out that coloured horses, which are black and white or brown and white, were really popular.
Oh.
They only started to become really popular in England, say, over the last 15 years.
Mm.
They were more associated with gypsy vanners and the travelling community, and people preferred solid coloured horses. But Edward I had a particular liking for black and white and brown and white horses, and he had quite a few in his stables as well. So, yes, there was a plethora of colours. Lots of bays, browns and blacks and dappled horses as well. But I particularly like the fact that they had these piebald and skewballs.
Yeah, I've never seen any contemporary illustrations of a piebald or skewbald horse in medieval images, but they're in the record. They're kind of written down.
Yeah, they are in the record.
Right, but they're not painted. I wonder whether it was just more complicated for an artist to paint a horse with
Perhaps.
patches.
Maybe.
Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe because, again, you have to understand what the painting is trying to do. It's not necessarily purely representative. It's often representative, but it's sort of a perspective, isn't it? It's how the patron who's paying for the painting would like to be seen, or at least it's how the artist who's being paid thinks that the patron wants to be seen, because they've got to get paid at the end of the day.
And I think that's why you get a lot of grey, well, we call them grey horses, they're white horses, but we call them grey. And we get a lot of those in the literature and also quite a lot in our manuscript images. But when I looked, they were very rare on a battlefield.
Mm.
Now, whether you would choose not to take a grey horse on campaign because it's just going to get filthy within 5 minutes and look terrible,
Yeah.
I don't know. Or it's more visible to the enemy's archers, perhaps,
Yeah.
as well.
Well, it might attract the eye. I certainly know that my white horses, my grade horses, you can see them at night. You're going out in the winter at sort of 5 o'clock in the evening, trying to find your horse and bring them in for the night. And the black ones and the brown ones you just can't see. It's because it's slightly foggy and it's like, where are you? Oh, you're there. Whereas the white ones, you can see them looming in the distance, like shining like lights, even though they're covered in mud. And you can get them in very, very easily. But yeah, I think having a white horse is almost like wearing white gloves. It's sort of almost showing you don't do any manual work. You've obviously got people to clean your horse. And well, without modern detergents, and you can sponge your horse down, but if it gets stable stains on it, you know what that's like.
Oh, it's awful. Absolutely awful. I've always said I'd never get another white horse.
And it's usually the night before an event, isn't it? And you go, your horse is all clean and all prepared for the battle. And then you come down in the morning and your horse has chosen his own dung to lie on that night. And there's a huge kind of greeny brown stain, like very obvious to everybody. And then the poor groom is going to go, oh no, dispenser's going to come down in a half an hour. And he's got dung all over the side of his horse. We better clean that off quickly. Quick, bring the buckets.
It's probably why they were getting through so many curry combs.
Well, yes, yeah.
Maybe.
I had a question. I don't know the answer to this one. I've not found anything. Did they clip their horses in the winter at all? I don't think they must have done, but they did have shears. And I wondered whether there's any sign of that kind of rugging up and clipping of horses in the medieval period.
Clipping, no.
Okay.
Rugs, yes. They did buy rugs, mostly wool rugs, and sometimes linen rugs in summer as well. And you find these in hippiatric manuals as well as in the royal accounts as well, that they recommend keep your horse warm in winter. So yes, we get woolen rugs bought for the stallions. And then in the summer, cover them in linen so that they don't get bitten by flies as well. So yes, we rugged them.
Right, we rugged them, but we didn't clip them. That's interesting.
We might have done, but I don't find evidence of it.
Right, okay. And again, for those that aren't familiar with horses, horses have a cycle of their coat. So in the summer, they often have very fine hair. And then as they go into the autumn, they start to grow their winter hair and they shed their summer coat. And then their coat usually grows much longer for the winter for obvious reasons. And then we have that wonderful time of the year when the winter coat starts shedding and there's hair everywhere. And no matter,
everywhere.
And no matter how much you brush, there seems to be more hair coming out. You brush the same patch and there's a handful of hair comes out. You keep brushing it and there's still hair coming out. And you think, how much hair has my horse got? And over a couple of weeks, it tends to come out. And you'll see when they roll out in the field, you leave a big patch of hair behind them. And this is something very familiar. But if you clip a horse, you don't notice that so much in the spring because the hair's already short. So when it falls out, it's just presumably it is just the length of the clipping. So people who clip their horses don't notice that in the same kind of way.
It's so much easier as well because a long-coated horse, it's going to sweat if it's in hard work as well and then get chilled as they cool down. So
that's a very good point.
There's practical reasons for clipping them. But no, it's interesting. I haven't come across anything like that yet.
Okay. Are there records of what they were fed and how they were managed? Obviously, there's water. They didn't have piped water, so they were going to carry buckets from the stream or something like that. But anybody with a horse and that has facilities that doesn't have mains water knows what that's all about today.
Yeah.
Is the horse husbandry mentioned in these records at all?
Yes, we do get buckets for the water. We also get big cooking pots bought to heat the water.
Oh.
Now, whether that's to wash the horses down or they're just wanting to, perhaps in winter, take the ice off, to try and warm up the water for them, I don't know. We also get oats, an awful lot of oats. That's what they were fed. And bran, and occasionally peas and beans.
Okay.
But the primary hard feed was oats, and they got about half a bushel each, the stallions.
So what's half a bushel?
Well, I worked it out as being 6 big scoops, roughly.
Wow, a day?
Yeah, a day.
That is... Whew.
It's a racehorse. It's a racehorse diet, basically.
Yeah, so oats tend to heat horses up. When you want a horse to move more physically or kind of give it more power, you can modify what it eats. So if a horse is just eating grass from the field, it will have a sort of base metabolism and typically be whatever it is. If If you want to get more energetic performance out of it, or it's doing more physical work, like combat, for example, you would give it oats, and that's a lot of oats.
It is a lot of it. I mean, we don't know exactly what the calorific value of medieval oats are compared to modern oats. They might have been higher or they might have been lower. I have fed oats to horses, and I do know that a very high energy content diet can make them almost hallucinate. They can have so much energy and also become a bit unmanageable as well.
Yes, yeah, particularly stallions, actually. That would be interesting, yeah.
But if they're working very hard, and I mean, you've got to think the medieval horse is a horse that's going to be ridden every day. It's going to be doing something no matter what its job is. And the fact that we're not quite certain on the calorific value, perhaps it was less calories.
And it might be being ridden almost all day, or certainly substantial part, and carrying the weight of a rider all day, possibly in armour, some of it. There's lots of different types of armour you can wear and different weights of it, but it's still substantial addition to what the horse might be expected. And on campaign, you've got to maintain this workforce. Horses are carrying things. All of the horses, you have pack ponies and all sorts of stuff as well, but they're carrying the people to enable the people to then go and fight on foot in some cases, or I presume sometimes knights rode horses for travel and then got on their destrier. Is that something in the record?
Yeah, that seems to be the traditional view, doesn't it, that we get from certain records. And it makes sense as well that you've got your war horse and you're not on its back all day, every day. You want to conserve that horse either for battle or a chevauchee for a raid as well, so that you'll have a riding horse and you'll have somebody lead that one.
I've seen pictures of small boys on war horses from Italy in particular of the period. And somebody said, well, look, that horse is massive. And it's like, no, that's a boy. That's not a man riding it, because the helmet's far too big and his legs hardly come down the side of the horse. That's a child of 10, 12 years old riding that horse. And that's presumably a squire in training, getting used to riding, or, the son of the knight showing off on the horse. So children were involved, at least at part, in looking after and riding these horses sometimes. These are at tournaments, though, but not in war.
Yes. I also think perhaps it's a bit of a ploy to make your horse look very big and grand by putting a very small person on it as well.
Oh, really?
And interestingly, I was trying to find women involved in horses and horse training, and it was very recently I did find a female horse trainer in 1307 who actually lived in the same town as me.
Oh, well.
Who was employed to break in the Lord's colts. So although we assume that, or I made the assumption, because it seemed to be mostly men involved, certainly in the high-ranking positions in the royal stunts, women did have a hands-on role in certain areas as well.
I think sometimes one of the problems is that women's roles didn't get recorded because it was sometimes men writing the records, and therefore they didn't feel it was necessary to record women's roles. And I think it's a really interesting area of study of what women's contribution to society in the medieval period was, because the record is very one-sided as far as I understand it.
Yeah. And if you don't have names, they don't tend to specify a gender anyway. You'll be a groom.
Yeah.
Or
that's true. So we assume, but we don't actually have any proof of what the gender was of that groom. That's wonderful. Well, look, we could probably talk a lot more. Can I finish off on just asking you what you feel the role of the warhorse was at this time? We talk about great magnates on very expensive horses and other types of soldier on cheaper horses. What do you think their battlefield role was?
The destrier seemed to be in front.
Okay.
And they were the ones that were leading the charge. And they also, percentage-wise, took the most casualties as well because of that. And then they tended to be followed by rank. So you'd have your retinue leader in the front, followed by his knights on the requie, and then his sergeants on rounces as well. Battles, though, were few and far between. And especially in Scotland, yes, they met a couple of times. We've got Falkirk, we've got Bannockburn. But in between, the biggest role of these horses were in chasing down the enemy across the Scottish countryside and then doing raids, chevauchées as well. And Edward III particularly employed these as well. Some of the raids or the pursuits of these men, I think I had one at 24 miles.
Oh, they chased after them. Wow.
Yeah, and this is why I start to see lots of horses getting lost or written off Because although we've got quite a few battles, and obviously there's a certain percentage of horses lost in battle, around about 8% would be killed in battle. Most of the horses that were written off on these campaigns, it was either disease, exposure, or exhaustion. And quite a bit of that exhaustion was on these types of raids. It was really hard going for war horses.
Oh, wow. So exhaustion and disease was a big problem for the horses as well.
Yeah, it was the same in the First and Second World Wars as well. About 75% of horses died from exposure and disease, and only about 25% in battle. And we see this reflected in the period I'm looking at as well. I mean, sometimes I've got retinues where they're losing 50% of their horses are having to be written off, and it's particularly if they're doing a winter campaign as well.
Oh, wow.
I mean, they did everything they could to look after them, though. They seem to try and look after them very well.
Oh, wow. And who paid for those horses? Did the king compensate people if they went on combat?
Yes, and Edward I did particularly. In fact, he sort of introduced large-scale horse insurance, which meant if you were a knight taking your war horse on campaign, you could have it inspected at the start of a campaign. The valuers would write its description down, give it a value, and if you lost that horse, if it was killed or if it was maimed or it just suffered exhaustion and you had to swap to another one, they would give you financial compensation for it. And this was no doubt to encourage knights to bring their good horses on campaign, because obviously it's such an expensive overhead for them as well.
Of course.
So yes, you could put in an insurance claim, and generally it was the retinue leaders would pay off their retinues and then try and get the money off the crown. That's another story, because that could take years.
I find that absolutely fascinating. So that was in part to encourage people to bring their best horses, because quite frankly, psychologically, if you're going on campaign to Scotland, you're hoping it's just going to be chasing a few people down and not having a proper battle, but you got your obligations. You just take your third or fourth best horse with you. And he was trying to say, no, bring your best horse. We want to win and we will compensate you. Maybe another time we can talk a little bit about attitudes towards horses as well, because it's something I get asked all the time on my YouTube channel, which is, how did they treat their horses, and did they love them like we do and look after them, or how was it?
Such a great question.
Can you touch on that very briefly before we finish?
Yeah, I mean, we don't see anything, because these are financial records, so we don't see anything about people loving their horses. We know in World War I that soldiers talk about forming bonds with their horses, so it is possible. But I think the one thing that stands out to me is a letter written to the king by an impoverished knight who says that he's fallen on hard times, he's sold everything he owns, his wife and 10 children are begging for food in the street, but he still has his war horse. It was the one thing he didn't give up. Now, you could say that, yes, that's so much to do with his status. It identifies him as a knight, and he could also still perform as a knight because he's got his war horse. But it could also perhaps show that, like the soldiers of World War I, he had this bond with his horse and he could not bear to part with it despite his dire circumstances.
Oh, wonderful anecdote to end on. So your book is called The War Horse in England.
Yes.
Is it available now?
It'll be available in February.
In February of 25.
25,
in case you're listening to this in a few years' time. Wonderful. Anything else? Do you have a blog or social media you want anybody to follow you on?
Not yet. I'm under the MedNed on Instagram, though. You can follow me on that.
Wonderful. And lastly, do you have horses?
I'm in between. It's a bit like being in between jobs at the moment. So yeah, circumstances kind of meant that I've had to have a sort of forced rest in between horses, but I'm absolutely itching to get another one. So it won't be too long before I will.
Well, wonderful. I look forward to hearing more about it. Thank you so much, Emma. That's been absolutely wonderful. I could happily talk for another 3 or 4 hours on the subject of horses, and maybe we can talk again in another few months or something. Maybe when your book is actually out, we can have another natter about it, because I might be able to give you a bit of information on my experiences as well of training war horses. And I have fought in tournament, really. I haven't ever fought a battle. I've had some pretty hairy moments on horses with lances and swords, but nothing really life-threatening, thankfully. So,
that would be great.
well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
My pleasure.